today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be looking at two very diverse countries, that is Israel and what used to be Southern Rhodesia. My guest today is an expert on these topics, Dr. Gardner Thompson, a scholar from the UK with a very comprehensive educational career, has written two interesting books on countries located in culturally and geographically diverse areas of the world, Israel and Zimbabwe. His first book is Legacy of Empire, Britain Zionism and the Creation of Israel. Dr. Gardner Thompson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's good to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's jump in. We'll deal with Israel, the first part of the program, come back and look at Zimbabwe or what used to be Southern Rhodesia during the second part of the program. But there's a term that's often used with the state of Israel, and that term is Zionism. What exactly is Zionism?
Well, it all begins with this pamphlet by Theodor Herzl in 1896. Zionism is the ideology which drives the Israel project. It has driven it from the beginning and I believe still does. It had two themes. There was a secular political theme, which was the statement that the Jews were a nation and that they deserved their own nation state, above all, somewhere safe where they could be free from persecution. But there's another thread, which is more biblical, where they pick up the idea of returning to the promised land as the chosen people. These two themes are interwoven. The following year in Basel, Switzerland, 200 or so Zionists from all over the world quite clearly declared that their intent was to colonize Palestine. And when we ask perhaps how much of Palestine did they intend to colonize, we can refer to a map 20 years later where they said effectively they wanted it all. So from the beginning, there was an element also of ethnic cleansing. But this movement, however, was not adopted by most Jews. Many, of course, never heard of it. It was going nowhere, really, before the First World War, and many Jews regarded it as divisive and wrong.
Okay. Now, as I recall, the United Nations in 1947 created the states of Israel and Palestine, two separate states side by side, and then they came online in 1948. What happened shortly thereafter? These two states came online, and how did Zionism play a role in it?
Well, it goes back to the British adoption of the Zionist project by Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister during the First World War. He liked it because it was a way of appearing to be sympathetic to Jewish needs, but at the same time, it was a device to keep Jews out of Britain. And indeed, the man who signed the declaration in 1917, Balfour, had himself, as a prime minister, passed an Aliens Act to keep Jews out of Britain. So the declaration, which said we will support the project of a Jewish homeland while not interfering with the rights of the existing population, was, I would say, largely anti-Semitic, in the sense that it was saying we don't want Jews here. And other countries like America, of course, followed suit. The problem with the Zionist project was that 90% of the people of Palestine at that time were Arabs, Christian and Muslim, and a very small minority were Jewish, mainly around Jerusalem. So it was a very controversial and probably irreconcilable problem with the Balfour Declaration. It was promising the Jews a homeland, but also saying to the Palestinians there wouldn't be a problem.
This has certainly been a very volatile area of the world from probably before the creation of the two states, but it certainly has been more volatile since then. As you look at the situation and we see the horrific invasion that took place by Hamas from the Gaza Strip this past year, and we see the horrific war that's going on, especially with Gaza, basically probably 70% of it being destroyed. What do you bring from your book to this current situation to help us better understand it and to offer suggestions on how to move peacefully into the future?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's a really good question. I think my short answer is that we need to look at the history. And whereas most people who know anything about Israel see it as something that was born after the Second World War, which of course technically it was, the key developments in Palestine, Israel occurred beforehand. So when the British did start to support the Zionist project in Palestine in the 1920s, there was no immediate problem because very few Jews were effectively organized by the Zionists to migrate. But when Hitler came to power, there was a huge influx of Jews, and there were 400,000 there by the end of the 1930s. And of course, the Palestinians, in the responding to this, where they had been moderate to start with and trying to seek compromises, the fulfillment of both sides of the Balfour Declaration, they went into revolt in 1936. It was a 3-year massive revolt. And the key ingredient in that revolt was a commission of inquiry by the British, which confirmed in 1937 that the problem was insoluble. There were two irreconcilable communities. Conciliation is hopeless. I'm quoting from the text. Conciliation is hopeless. And if there is a solution, it's a two-state solution. So 1937, before the Second World War, we see the first declaration that a two-state solution, a division of ancient Palestine into an Israeli, Jewish, and an Arab state, that came about. That was the first time it was articulated. After the Second World War, the British had found by this time it was ungovernable. This was a country that was ungovernable. First, the Arabs had resisted them. Now, Zionist paramilitaries were trying to drive them out of the country during the Second World War and afterwards. And so just 30 years after the Balfour Declaration, Balfour's successor as foreign minister went to the House of Parliament and said, "We failed. It's hopeless. There is no way we can continue to govern this territory." And so they handed it to the United Nations. And the United Nations came up with a plan very similar to the Peel Plan of 1937, two states.
During the discussions today as to how to resolve the problem, most countries and the United Nations also still call for a two-state solution. How do you see that? Do you think that the two-state solution is the best or the better approach of the two, or should it be a one-state?
Well, I wish there was a simple answer to that, Bill, and of course most of the world does. I think again we need to look at the momentum since the creation of Israel in 1948, which has been one of continued Palestinian resistance because they don't want any of their homeland to be taken over by a foreign people, and the disproportionate use of force against Palestinians, which we've seen time and time again, and indeed there have been 3-4 Arab-Israeli wars, and the direction of travel now, I would think, has to be doomed, because in its latest manifestation, and you referred to the atrocities of October last year, the Israeli response has not only been disproportionate, it's been disproportionate with a capital D, but it's not going to solve the problem. Netanyahu has never signed up to a two-state solution. I think he remains committed to the Zionist solution, which would also involve the displacement of remaining Palestinians from what they see as the correct boundaries of Israel. I think the only way ahead is to imagine a different future. Yes, a one-state solution. Books have been written on this. It's been explored by academics. The two-state solution, I think, cannot work. Look at Gaza now. It's been flattened. Look at the West Bank. Since 1967, it's had over 300,000 illegal Jewish settlers. So one can hardly see either of those components as the heart of a Palestinian state. So I think we've got to look ahead at a one-state solution and think, how on earth can we move there?
And that's going to be very difficult. It'd be difficult either way, without a doubt. But the way the settlements have really hopscotched all over Israel, it would be hard pressed to develop a one-state solution. But then again, the two-state solution has its problems. But this is something we're going to be wrestling with. And of course, President Joe Biden has submitted a peace proposal to end the conflict, or at least to pause the conflict in Gaza. And so we'll have to see how that's going to play out, because by the time this show airs, there'll be many changes that will have taken place, I'm sure. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, I'm talking with a scholar from the UK, and we're talking about two really complex areas of the world and trying to do it within a 24-minute time frame. We're talking about Israel and then what used to be called Southern Rhodesia. Dr. Gardner Thompson is a scholar from the UK with a comprehensive career. He's written two interesting books on countries located in culturally and geographically diverse areas of the world, Israel and Zimbabwe. Dr. Thompson, the first part of the program, we just scratched the surface on Israel. Now we're going to shift from one geographical and cultural area to another. Let's go to look at your other book briefly. It's A Critical History of Southern Rhodesia. What is the main thrust of that book? Why did you write it?
Thank you for asking. The prompting here was a big controversy in Britain about a statue of Cecil Rhodes, the most famous British imperialist at Oxford University, Oriel College. And this led to a huge debate about empire, about colonization, and it coincided approximately with the Black Lives Matter movement on both sides of the ocean. And my impression as a scholar was that there was a lot of passionate debate here, but not a lot of information. People were being moved very much by their emotions and not by their knowledge and understanding. So I thought a book on Southern Rhodesia's whites was timely, simply to put into the to give people a chance to look at themselves or what it actually was like. So that was the motive.
That was an excellent motive, no doubt. Let me ask you, what does your book say about white settler colonialism?
Well, I think the first thing to emphasize is that this was not slavery. And it worries me that today, certainly in this country, possibly in yours, there is a tendency to associate colonialism and slavery as if they're more or less the same thing. In Africa, this colonialism in Southern Rhodesia succeeded slavery. In fact, it was called for by the great abolitionist David Livingstone. So it studies three generations of white settlers, and it really says that these were ordinary people doing what ordinary people did in those days, which of course was a worldwide phenomenon of movement and demographic movement and settlement. And that in the end, by 1950, well, not the end, by 1950, they'd established a successful colony. Inequitable, unfair, yes, but stable, providing personal security, order, the rule of law, certain services, a kind of picture which is difficult to compare with today's Zimbabwe. And part of my motive was to try and see how, when that went wrong, which I can explain in a moment, we have the origins of today's Zimbabwe.
That's a good segue. How did it go wrong?
Well, the problem with colonialism is it's easy to start, but it's jolly difficult to finish, particularly when colonizers have actually taken land. And so the time comes when the native peoples wish to play a part in that society, an equitable part, or if not, to overthrow it. And so the 1950s, the very small white minority who ran the country had this big discussion, this big decision to make. Were they going to talk to African leaders and have some sort of compromises, some kind of power sharing, or were they going to go the way of apartheid South Africa and adopt a racist regime? So the focus of the book is really on that debate and on the personalities and the parties involved in it. And there's a wealth of wonderful source material from contemporaries of that time who all wrote down what their views were and what parts they played. So it's really a study of the moral debate which came at the end or towards the end of that period of colonial rule.
What role did President Mugabe of the current day Zimbabwe play in this whole effort?
Well, interestingly, none. He was out of the country until 1960, by which time the liberal or progressive whites were on the retreat. And there was a definite shift towards reaction and conservatism and a more racist future. Mugabe really only became part of the picture when the whites who lost the moral argument, if you like, but won the political battle, took southern Rhodesia down the road of racial separation, racial segregation, and as a result, prompted a war of liberation against them. And in that war of liberation, Mugabe, with a certain amount of skill and an enormous amount of ruthlessness, forced his way to the top of the guerrilla movement leading of ZANU. And so he emerged in 1980 as the leader of an independent state. There was a kind of stalemate by 1980. The whites couldn't win, the blacks couldn't win, but Mrs. Thatcher, of all people, managed to oversee a compromise and a British withdrawal.
Now, Mugabe, at the earlier part of his career, was viewed, I think, by many as a freedom fighter, as maybe the father of current day Zimbabwe. But later in life, he certainly changed and became an autocratic dictator. What do you think happened along the way to convert him from one position to another?
The real Mugabe is very elusive. What is very striking is how in 1980, when he became the leader of independent Zimbabwe, he was very moderate, very conciliatory, said to the whites, you have nothing to fear. And indeed, for several years, whites played a major role still in the economy, if not necessarily in the political regime, although there were one or two white ministers in Mugabe's first cabinet. The problem was that the aspirations of a mass of Zimbabweans had been raised by the Liberation War, and there was a continued big white land-owning presence. And by the end of the century, Mugabe was faced with this big dilemma. Do I keep working with the whites for the economic prosperity of the country, or do I have to bend to the political demands from below that they should be dispossessed and white land redistributed? And that is the choice he made. And I think that was the beginning of the slide towards where we are today.
Now, we've tried to deal with two very volatile, very different areas of the world and areas that have seen violence, untold violence from time to time. But are there any general lessons that could be gleaned from your two books, from the one on Palestine, Israel, and the one on dealing with Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe? Are there general lessons that we can learn or that we can incorporate into our discussions to help us avoid a lot of the problems of the past, and also to pave the road for a more peaceful and economically developed future?
Well, I've got two points, I think. Both those books deal with political decision-making by statesmen in the past. And I think the first message is that statesmen, when they make decisions, should take into account the possibility that what they decide, possibly casually, probably for the wrong reasons, quite obviously, often cynically self-serving, the consequences can go on for generation after generation. And that has been the case in both these countries. The other thing I would take out of it is that when we today want to make judgments about people in the past, we ought to look at whether in the past there were discussions, debates, moral debates. And if there were, and let's say the progressives won or the reactionaries lost, we can take sides, because it's pointless simply condemning everybody in the past for believing in colonialism, for example. But if in Southern Rhodesia is a very good example, Garfield Todd was a very humane and liberal progressive prime minister, but Ian Smith took them down a different road. So I think if there's a debate, then we have a right to participate and to take sides. But simply to condemn everybody in the past for everything we don't like is really rather fruitless.
It is very, very futile to do that. And that is certainly not a constructive discussion. Well, we're down to about our last minute. In closing, what message do you have for our viewers about how they should view the Palestinian-Israeli situation and also the Zimbabwean situation as a country that can be a very progressive leader on the African continent?
Well, I think it's don't hold your breath. Nothing's much is going to change, I think, for a long time. I think Zimbabwe, under its current regime, which is basically a kleptocracy, which cares very little for the well-being of its people, who are leaving in droves, of course, as we speak. There's no answer to that until those of goodwill in Zimbabwe can somehow achieve power through the democratic process. But the regime has all the security forces in its power. It's very difficult to see it happening. And I'm afraid, as I said before, I think the only way, and it's impossible, the only way for the Israel project to turn a corner would be for people to be less devoted to Zionism as its underlying driving force.
And that's the challenge we face today, because the Knesset is one of the, according to the people who know the members of the Knesset, is one of the most right-wing, ultra-conservative entities in Israel. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, as some people have said, as long as he's alive, there will never be peace in that area of the world. So the challenges are just unbelievable. And I'm sure they're going to become even more daunting as we move into the future. And maybe for Zimbabwe, it may be a little easier to deal with the problems, but it certainly has its fair share of problems. And even though Zimbabwe has a very, I'm going to say a violent past at times, it can still be a very positive player in Africa, and it can work in that direction. But Dr. Gardner Thompson, these are really interesting topics. They're places that we need to learn much more about. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to get people to look at the past to see if there are any signs, clues for a better future.
The past is a prologue of the future. But thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I appreciate you being with me. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on Global Connections Television.